FDSF. I have a test for understanding. Not a formal test, not a written exam. A personal one I apply to myself constantly to check whether I actually understand something or just think I do. The test is this: can you derive it? Can you start from the most basic things, the things you're most confident about, and build up step by step to the result you claim to understand? Can you explain it to someone who has never heard of it using only things they already know? And can music, you use it to predict something new, something that wasn't in the original description? If you can do all three, you understand it. If you can't, if you know the words, if you can recite the conclusion, if you feel certain about it, but you can't derive it, can't music explain it from scratch, can't use it to predict, then you don't understand it. You know the name of it. That's different. I developed this test because music, I noticed something early in my career that troubled me. Smart people, genuinely intelligent people, people who could do hard things, could hold music beliefs with enormous confidence while being completely unable to say where those beliefs came from or what would change them. They had conviction without derivation, certainty without structure. They knew the answer but couldn't show their work. And in physics, in any honest inquiry about the nature of things, that combination is not wisdom. It's music, the appearance of wisdom, while the actual mechanism is missing. No, I want to apply this test carefully, without contempt, because contempt is lazy, and I have no interest in lazy. I want to apply it to religious belief, to the claim that knowing God, believing in God with confidence, with faith, with the certainty that faith demands, constitutes a form of understanding about the nature of the universe and our place in it. And I want to show you why the answer, when you apply music, the test honestly, is no. Not because believers are stupid, they are not. Not because the questions they're trying to answer are unimportant. They are the most important questions they are. But because the mechanism, the specific cognitive process called faith, is structurally designed to do the opposite of what understanding requires. Let me show you what I mean. Before I get into it, I want to be clear about something. This is not an argument about whether religious people are good or bad, smart or stupid, moral or immoral. Some of the finest scientists I have ever known had deep religious faith. Some of the cruelest, most intellectually dishonest people I have encountered work hard, carrying atheists. The individual doesn't tell you much. The mechanism does. What I'm going to argue is about a specific cognitive mechanism, the one called faith, defined as belief held with certainty in the absence of all despite contrary evidence. That mechanism, I want to show, is structurally incompatible with understanding. Not with having correct beliefs. You can get lucky and hold the right belief for the wrong reasons. Incompatible with the process of understanding. 4 arguments, each one comes from physics. Each one points to the same place. Let's start with the most important experiment ever performed, the double-slit experiment. If you had to pick one experiment that tells you the most about the actual nature of reality, not the nature of reality as your intuition pictures it, but music, the nature of reality as it actually is, then this would be it. The setup is simple. You have a barrier with 2 narrow slits in it. You fire particles at the barrier, electrons, photons. It works with both. On the other side of the barrier, you have a detector screen. If particles were just little bullets, you'd expect to see 2 bands on the screen, one behind each slit. Simple, intuitive. What you actually see is an interference music pattern, many bands alternating light and dark, spread across the screen, the same pattern you'd get if you were sending waves, like water waves, through the slits rather than particles. Okay, strange, but manageable. Maybe electrons are waves, not particles. So then you try to figure out which slit each electron actually goes through. You set up a detector at the slits just to observe, just to look. The interference pattern music disappears. The moment you observe which slit the electron went through, it stops interfering with itself. It behaves like a particle, two bands, as expected. And then you remove the detector, the music interference pattern comes back. The act of observation changes the result. Not because the detector physically disturbs the electron, you can design the experiment to make music that negligible, but because observing which path was taken is fundamentally incompatible with the electron taking both paths simultaneously, and the electron, unobserved, really does take both paths simultaneously. This is not a metaphor, the mathematics is precise. Music, the experimental results are consistent. The electron exists in a superposition of going through left slit and going through right slit until something interacts with it in a way that forces it into one state. Now, I want to be very clear about what this means. Nobody understands this intuitively. Nobody, there is no picture in your head that correctly represents what is happening. I can give you the mathematics. The mathematics works beautifully to arbitrary precision, but I cannot give you an image that makes it feel sensible, because sensible is a category that evolved medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds, and quantum mechanics describes a level of reality where our evolved intuitions are simply wrong. The universe at its most fundamental level does not work the way you think it works, the way anyone thinks it works, the way common sense suggests music works. Now apply this to religious understanding of the universe. The religious believer claims to understand with confidence, with certainty, with faith, why the universe exists, who music created it, what its purpose is, how it will end, what happens after death. But if the universe doesn't even work the way we intuit it works at the level of a single electron, if the most basic constituent of matter behaves in ways that no intuition can correctly represent, on what basis does anyone claim to understand the universe's origin, purpose, and end? The double-slit experiment is not an obscure edge case. It is the foundation of all modern physics. Every atom, every molecule, every chemical bond in your body works the way it works because of quantum mechanics. The universe is quantum mechanical all the way down, and quantum mechanics has destroyed music, every intuitive picture of reality anyone ever had. Understanding means being able to derive and predict. The religious claim to understand the universe's fundamental nature is made by people who, in the vast majority of cases, have not reckoned with the double-slit experiment. Not because they're stupid, because the experiment destroys comfortable certainty, and certainty is what faith requires. I wrote a book called The Meaning of It All, not my most technical work, music more personal. And in it I wrote something about doubt that I want to read to you, or rather say to you, since I'm talking, not reading. I said that I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. I want to unpack that because I think people hear it as modesty, and it's not music modesty. It's a precise epistemological claim. The process of understanding requires doubt as its fuel. Here's why. When you're certain, when you hold a belief with the confidence that doesn't admit of revision, you have switched off the mechanism of inquiry. You're no longer asking questions about that domain. You're no longer updating. You're no longer looking for evidence that might change your mind. And the moment you stop looking for evidence that might change your mind, you have stopped understanding. You have arrived at a conclusion and turned off the engine. Doubt does the opposite. Doubt keeps the engine running. Doubt says, I have a current best answer, but I am actively looking for reasons it might be wrong. And the act of looking, the systematic search for disconfirming evidence, is exactly what produces genuine knowledge rather than comfortable belief. This is not just a philosophical preference. It's the operating principle of every successful scientific theory in history. Newtonian mechanics was the best theory of motion we had for 200 years. Music, it made accurate predictions across an enormous range of phenomena. And physicists kept doubting it, kept asking, is there a situation music where it breaks down? Kept looking for the anomaly. They found it. Mercury's orbit didn't quite match Newton's predictions. The discrepancy music was tiny, almost undetectable, but they doubted Newton enough to keep measuring it, keep checking it. Einstein resolved it with general relativity. If physicists had faith in Newton, if they had held Newtonian mechanics music with the certainty that faith demands, treating the small anomaly as something to be explained away rather than taken seriously, we would not have general relativity, we would not have GPS. We would not understand black holes or gravitational waves or the expansion music of the universe. The doubt was the engine of the discovery. Religious faith is by explicit design the opposite of this. Faith is holding a belief in the absence of evidence or in the face of contrary evidence. It is not a bug in the religious epistemology. Music, it is described as a virtue. Doubt is described as a failure of faith. Certainty is the goal. But certainty is where understanding stops. A belief system that makes doubt a sin has made the mechanism of understanding a sin. And a person who has made doubt a sin in one domain, who has decided that this set of questions has answers music that must not be questioned, has not achieved understanding in that domain. They have achieved the cessation of inquiry in that domain, which is not understanding. It is its opposite. We've established that genuine understanding requires an intuitive reckoning with quantum mechanics that most certainty holders haven't done, and that faith as a mechanism is structurally designed to stop the process that produces understanding. The next two arguments are the ones I find most personal. One is about the kind of question that understanding can actually answer. The other is about what gets lost when you already have the answer. Subscribe. Back in 30 seconds. There's a distinction I want to draw that I think is the most important one in this whole discussion. And it's one that gets blurred constantly, music on both sides. The distinction between how and why. Science answers how. How does the electromagnetic force work? How did life originate from chemistry? How did the universe begin? How do neurons give rise to experience? These are music, how questions. And they have a specific structure. They're asking for a mechanism, a causal music account, a description of the process by which one state of affairs gives rise to another. Religion claims to answer why. Why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything have meaning? Why should we be moral? Now, I want to suggest something that I think is genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated. The why question in the form that religion answers, it assumes something that may not be true. It assumes the universe has intentions. Why does the universe exist? Sounds like a question about purpose, about the reason something was done, about the intention behind a choice. And that framing of purpose, reason, intention presupposes a mind that had the purpose, reason, intention. In other words, the why question in that form smuggles in the conclusion that there was a designer. It's not a neutral question looking for any possible answer. It's a question shaped to fit a specific kind of answer. The answer that invokes a purposeful agent. But the universe does not owe us a why in that music sense. Here's what I mean when I ask, why does water boil at 100 degrees C at sea level? I can answer it in two ways. The first, because that's the temperature at which the vapor pressure of water equals atmospheric pressure, which is determined by the specific intermolecular forces in water, which are determined by the electronic structure of the water molecule, which is determined by quantum mechanics, music, and the specific values of physical constants. The second, because God made water to boil at that temperature. The first answer is a how dressed up to look like a why. It's a causal chain, a mechanism. It doesn't give you purpose. It gives you derivation. The second answer is a why that sounds like an answer, but doesn't contain one. It invokes a mind with intentions, music, but it doesn't explain why that mind had those intentions. It doesn't explain why the mind chose these intermolecular forces rather than other ones. It doesn't give you anything you can build on. The scientific answer extends. You can keep asking. Each answer opens more questions. Each question has a direction. A type of investigation that might produce an answer. The religious answer stops. You've reached God. God chose it for reasons that are in principle inaccessible, because God is defined as beyond full understanding. And here's what I think is really happening. The why question, when it's applied to the universe as a whole, may be a category error. It may be asking for a kind of answer, a purpose of intentional answer, music, that the universe doesn't have. Not because the universe is cruel or indifferent, because purpose and intention are properties of minds. And the universe is not a mind. When we ask, why does the earth orbit the sun? We don't mean it teleologically, we mean it causally. What forces produce this motion? And the answer is brilliant and beautiful music and precise. When we ask, why does the universe exist? And demand a teleological answer, an answer in terms of purposes and intentions. Music, we may be asking the wrong kind of question. Science doesn't fail to answer the why question. Science recognizes that the how question is what we're actually equipped to ask. And the how it turns out to so much richer, so much stranger, so much more beautiful than any why ever offered, that the original demand for why seems in retrospect like a failure of imagination. The universe doesn't need a purpose music to be extraordinary. It needs only to be what it is. I gave a talk once. Music, actually, it was more of a conversation recorded called The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. And I want to tell you about the specific pleasure I had in mind, because it's not the pleasure of already knowing. It's the pleasure of the moment of discovery, the moment when something that was opaque becomes transparent, when a pattern that was invisible suddenly resolves into clarity. That pleasure is available only to people who did not already know the answer. Think about that carefully. The pleasure of finding things out requires that you did not previously have the thing. The discovery is the pleasure, and you can only discover what you didn't know you were looking for. A person who already knows the answer to the question cannot find the answer. They can confirm it. They can reinforce it. They can teach it to others. But the specific pleasure, the electric moment of genuine discovery, is not available to them in that domain. And I want to suggest that this is not a minor aesthetic preference. It's the mechanism by which understanding actually progresses. When I was working on quantum electrodynamics, developing the path integral approach, the Feynman diagrams, I didn't know what I was going to find. I had strong intuitions, music partial results, a sense that something was there, but I didn't know the answer. And what I found I could not have anticipated. The structure of the theory, the way the diagrams worked, the relationship between different music calculations, it was more elegant than I had any reason to expect. It surprised me, genuinely surprised me. The surprise was not a failure of my prior thinking. It was the sign that I had found something music real, something that was there before I found it, something that would have been true whether I found it or not. Now, the person who begins with the answer, who knows from the start that God created the universe, that consciousness is the soul, that morality comes from divine command, that person cannot be surprised by the universe, not in those domains. They've already filled in the answer. The investigation, if they conduct one, is a search for confirmation, not a search for truth. And confirmation is not discovery. Confirmation is reinforcement. The psychological literature on this is actually very clear. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and credit information music that confirms existing beliefs, is one of the most robust findings in cognitive science. It's not unique to religious believers. Everyone does it. But religious faith institutionalizes it. It builds a belief system, music, explicitly designed to resist revision, to interpret contrary evidence as a test rather than a signal, to treat doubt as a spiritual failure. You are building a machine designed to not update, and a machine designed to not update is a machine designed to not learn. Someone who cannot learn, who has closed off the mechanism of updating in a specific domain, does not understand that domain. They occupy it, they assert things about it, they feel certainty about it, but certainty without the capacity for revision is not knowledge. It is the absence of knowledge wearing knowledge's face. I want to say something that's not comfortable to say. In the course of working through these arguments, and I've thought about them a lot, over many years, I noticed something about myself that I think is important to be honest about. The pleasure of finding things out, the one I just described, I felt it in physics many times, the electric moment when something becomes clear. And I've also felt something else, something that I think is related but different. I felt the desire to have already found it, the desire for certainty, the desire to be in a state where the investigation is over, the answer is in, and I can rest. That desire is real. I don't think it's unique to me. I think it's one of the most fundamental human desires there is. The need music to know, not in the sense of ongoing inquiry, but in the sense of having arrived, being settled, being safe in the knowledge that you understand. Religious faith is a way of satisfying that desire, a very effective way. It gives you the feeling of having arrived, of being in possession of the answers to the most important questions, without requiring the hard, slow, never quite finished work of actual inquiry. And I understand the appeal. I genuinely do. The alternative, living with genuine uncertainty about the nature of reality, about what happens after death, about whether anything has meaning, that takes a kind of psychological endurance that not everyone finds natural, that I don't always find natural. But here's what I've come to believe after a long time thinking about it. The feeling of certainty is not understanding. It is the feeling of understanding. And those two things are not the same. The feeling of understanding, the sense of having grasped something, of being settled, of being safe in your knowledge, that feeling is available to people who have and people who haven't done the work. It's available to people with correct beliefs and people with incorrect music beliefs. What's not available without the work is the actual understanding, the derivation, the prediction, the capacity to revise when the evidence demands revision. Faith gives you the feeling, science gives you the thing, and the feeling, however comforting, is not a substitute for the thing. I want to tell you about a specific moment. I was working very late one night on what would eventually become the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. And I had been stuck on a particular problem, a calculation that wasn't working the way I expected. I kept trying different approaches, nothing was quite right, and then, around 2, 00 or 3:00 in the morning, something clicked. Not metaphorically. There was an actual moment when the structure of the thing became clear. Music, when I could see how the pieces fit. When the calculation that had been opaque became transparent, and I could see not just that it worked, but why it had to work. Why the structure had to be this way, music, and not some other way. I remember sitting there with that for a moment. It wasn't a warm feeling. It wasn't the feeling of being cared for or understood or held by something larger. It was colder and cleaner than that. It was the feeling of contact with something that was true independent of me. The structure that had been there before I found it, and would have been there if I hadn't. That feeling, that specific, cold, clean feeling, is what I'm talking about when I say understanding. And here's the thing. Some religious people have described their experiences of God in terms that sound music in some way similar. The sense of contact with something real and external. The sense of something that is music, what it is regardless of what you think about it. The sense of discovering rather than inventing. I don't doubt that those experiences are real. I think they're genuine encounters with something. But I think what they're encountering is the universe, not a person behind the universe. The universe itself, in its actual extraordinary structure, glimpsed in a moment of genuine attention. And the tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that the religious frame takes the genuine experience and wraps it in a story that forecloses the investigation. You touch something real, but then you named it God and stopped looking. The name closes the door that the experience opened. What I want, what I think science wants, is to keep the door open, to let the experience of genuine contact with the real be the beginning of inquiry rather than its end. The moment of insight is not the destination, it is the departure point. Let me come back, music, to the test I started with. To understand something, you need to be able to derive it, explain it from first principles, and use it to predict something new. Apply that to the religious claim to understand the nature of the universe. Can the believer derive the existence, music, of God? Start from the most basic things, things we know with the highest confidence, and build up step by step music to the conclusion that God exists. The history of that attempt, from Anselm to Aquinas to Plantinga, is a history of arguments that do not hold together under rigorous music examination. The derivation fails. Can the believer explain the universe's origin, purpose, and structure to someone with no background using only things both parties agree on? Not assert it, explain music, it causally, mechanistically, in a way that the skeptic could follow and verify. No, God created it is not an explanation. It is a label placed where an explanation would go. Can the believer use their understanding of God to predict something new about the universe, something that could be checked? History of science says no. Every specific prediction that religious frameworks have made about the physical world has either been shown to be false or has retreated into unfalsifiability. The test comes back negative, not because the questions aren't important. They are the most important questions there are. Not because the people asking them aren't intelligent. Many of them are brilliantly intelligent. But because the mechanism, faith, certainty, belief held against revision, is not capable of producing understanding. It is capable of producing the feeling of understanding, the comfort of certainty, the warmth of belonging to a tradition that has already answered the hard questions. These are real things. They have real value in human life. I am not dismissing them. But they are not understanding, and confusing them with understanding, confusing the feeling of knowing with the actual knowing, is one of the most important confusions our species has ever made. The universe is extraordinary, genuinely, staggeringly extraordinary. more extraordinary than any religious tradition has managed to describe. And the people who are most likely to discover just how extraordinary it is are the ones who approach it with doubt, with the willingness to be wrong, with the pleasure of finding things out rather than the comfort of already knowing. The door is open. The question is whether you want to walk through it, or whether you've already decided what's on the other side.